The clink of a wine glass echoed like a death bell in the dim restaurant. Celia Morgan felt the chill crawl up her spine before she even looked up. Her fingers tightened around the linen napkin in her lap as if that soft fabric could anchor her to reality. 30 years. That was how long she had loved him, believed in him, built a life around him. Yet when Daniel lifted his glass, he didn't look at her. He looked at the woman sitting beside him. His smile smooth and polished, the kind that once meant love but now whispered betrayal. "To new beginnings," he said. His voice was steady, calm, the same tone he used when closing a deal. Celia felt the room tilt slightly. Her pulse thudded in her ears, but she kept her expression still. The candlelight flickered between them, casting gold shadows across a life that was already crumbling. The woman beside him, Arya, laughed softly. Too softly. The sound slid under Celia's skin like a blade. Arya's hand brushed Daniel's sleeve. Casual, practiced, intimate. Celia caught the small motion, the protective way Arya's other hand moved toward her stomach. "I'm pregnant," Arya said, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction. The world seemed to pause. The waiter froze mid-pour. The air itself turned thick and sour. Pregnant. Celia's chest felt hollow. Daniel didn't even glance at her. His gaze stayed locked on Arya, glowing with pride. For a heartbeat, Celia couldn't move. 30 years of marriage collapsed in a single sentence. But she didn't cry. She didn't scream or cause a scene. Instead, she smiled, slow, deliberate, the kind of smile that required control when her hands trembled under the table. She already knew. She had known for weeks. She knew about the secret bank transfers, the hotel receipts disguised as business dinners, the text messages that began with M. Red Heart. She had seen enough to understand what kind of man Daniel had become, or maybe who he had always been. For 6 weeks she had prepared. Tonight wasn't surprise. It was confirmation. She lifted her own glass, eyes steady. "To new beginnings," she echoed, her tone light but poisoned with truth. Daniel finally turned to her. His confident smirk faltering just slightly when he met her gaze. "I emptied the joint accounts this morning," Celia said quietly. The words slid across the table like a blade. "I froze the company assets. And I filed for divorce." The silence that followed was so sharp it could cut glass. The waiter blinked, unsure whether to stay or flee. Arya's mouth fell open in disbelief, her hand dropping from Daniel's arm. Daniel's face drained of color. For the first time in decades, he looked lost, a man who had just realized the game had changed, and he wasn't winning anymore. Celia placed her napkin gently on the table, stood and said, "Enjoy your new beginning." Her heels clicked against the marble floor as she walked away. Every sound echoed like a heartbeat. The scent of marinara clung to the air, mingling with the perfume of endings. She passed the same spot by the entrance where she had once stood waiting for him, their anniversary dinner last year, when he'd arrived late and smiling, claiming work ran long. She had believed him then. Not anymore. The hostess blinked as Celia passed, confusion flickering across her face, but Celia didn't stop. Outside, the night air felt like freedom. Cool, vast, and endless. She inhaled deeply, a tremor running through her body. She wasn't walking away from a man. She was walking into her own resurrection. Celia didn't drive home. Not to the house filled with his cologne and her silence. She had a plan, a checklist she'd rehearsed in her mind until it became instinct. She wasn't the Celia Morgan who apologized for existing, who smiled through every insult masked as advice. That woman had died the moment Arya touched her stomach and called it a miracle. This Celia was done being the quiet partner. The game had begun, and she had made the first move. "Checkmate in progress," she whispered to herself as she walked toward her car. The silence inside the car was unbearable, not because of sound but memory. Every inch of that black leather interior reminded her of Daniel. The road trips, the anniversaries, the arguments that always ended with her apologizing. Her hands gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles whitened. The tremor in her chest wasn't fear. It was adrenaline, raw and electric. She thought back to the day they bought their Pasadena home. The smell of paint, the cheap coffee machine, Daniel's words. One day this place will be full of memories. He was right. Just not the kind either of them imagined. She had given up everything for him. Her career, her identity, her voice. Before Daniel, she'd been a rising interior designer. One of her projects even got featured in Sunset magazine. But he convinced her his business needed her full attention. "You're my rock," he'd said. "You keep everything running." And she had. She managed the books before they could afford an accountant, hosted client dinners, smiled on cue, introduced as Daniel's wife. Never as Celia, never as the woman who built half his empire behind the scenes. For years she told herself that was love. Because if it wasn't, then what had her life been? The week after their 10th anniversary, Celia miscarried. She never told Daniel. He was away on a business trip. No point in worrying him, she had told herself then. She carried that loss quietly, like she carried everything else. Grief, loneliness, disappointment. She buried it all beneath polished smiles and flawless dinner parties. Tonight, sitting in the driver's seat with the city lights blurring through tears she refused to shed, she realized how much she had carried, and how little he had noticed. She started the engine. The car's hum sounded like a heartbeat, finally her own. Celia checked into a small motel outside Glendale. Clean, quiet, anonymous, just as she wanted. She had paid in cash that morning. The clerk didn't even look up when she signed the form. Inside, she sat on the edge of the bed, her body trembling as the adrenaline drained away. The silence pressed in, heavy and familiar. Then came the buzz of her phone. Missed calls, Daniel's name lighting the screen. She ignored them. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a folder labeled in neat handwriting. Contingency plan, CM inside. Bank statements, asset transfers, and legal papers she'd written herself. She smiled faintly. "You should have read the fine print, Daniel," she whispered. For the first time in years, she felt alive. Celia leaned back against the headboard, staring at the ceiling. One of those ugly motel ceilings, textured like it was hiding secrets. Her heart still beat fast, but beneath the exhaustion was something sharper. Purpose. She reached for her laptop, opening the secure folder she'd built over the past month. Dozens of files glowed on the screen. Bank records, contracts, property documents, even copies of Daniel's emails. Every file was proof of his betrayal. She checked the transfer one last time. The company's accounts were frozen, perfectly timed. Without her digital signature, the business couldn't move a cent. Daniel would wake up tomorrow to an empire in stasis. A monument to his arrogance, now completely out of reach. As the minutes passed, her thoughts drifted back to Arya. That smug little smile. The way she rubbed her stomach like a prize trophy. Celia's stomach twisted. Arya was barely 30, young enough to be their goddaughter. In fact, she was their goddaughter. That memory hit. Like a sledgehammer. Arya's 6th birthday. Balloons, cake, laughter. Daniel kneeling beside the little girl, handing her a pink stuffed bear. "She looks just like you did, Celia, at that age," he'd said with a chuckle. Back then it had sounded sweet. Now it was poison. Her breath caught. Her mind replayed every moment she had dismissed, every small resemblance she had ignored. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. The next morning, Celia drove to the county records office. She stood in line under harsh fluorescent lights, surrounded by strangers who had no idea she was holding a detonator in her purse. When it was her turn, she requested a copy of Arya Wallace's birth certificate. It took nearly 3 hours of bureaucracy, polite smiles, and waiting. When she finally unfolded the document, the world tilted. Mother, Karen Wallace. Father, Daniel Morgan. Celia's throat tightened. No tears, no gasps, just a cold, hollow silence. The truth was there in black ink. She had raised her husband's daughter. She gripped the paper so tightly her nails bit into her palm, but she didn't let go. Celia sat in her car in the parking lot, staring through the windshield at nothing. Her hands shook, but her eyes were dry. It wasn't sadness anymore. It was clarity. The man she had built her life around had been building another family in the shadows, one she had unknowingly helped raise. She let out a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. It echoed in the car like a scream muffled in glass. "You planned everything," she whispered. "Even her." Her reflection stared back at her from the rearview mirror, eyes red but sharp, alive in a way she hadn't seen in years. The woman looking back wasn't broken. She was dangerous. By evening, Celia arrived at her sister's house. Lydia opened the door before Celia could knock twice. "I knew something was wrong," Lydia said quietly, handing her a glass of wine before Celia even spoke. They sat in the kitchen, the familiar hum of the refrigerator grounding her. Celia spread the papers on the table, the forged signatures, the transfer records, the birth certificate. Lydia's face drained of color as she scanned each page. "This is criminal," she whispered. Celia shook her head slowly. "It's Daniel. That makes it worse. No one ever believes the charming ones." They sat in silence until Lydia asked softly, "So, what are you going to do?" Celia looked up, her lips curving into a slow, deliberate smile. "I'm going to take everything he built," she said, "and make him watch me do it." The next morning dawned unnaturally bright. Pasadena skies, clean and cruel. Celia dressed in a cream blazer, her hair pinned neatly. She looked calm, composed, unstoppable. At 8 a.m. sharp, she walked into the courthouse, her heels tapping a rhythm of retribution. The clerk barely looked up when she handed over the file labeled Morgan versus Morgan. Divorce petition. Emergency injunction. Corporate freeze under Clause 14C of the founding agreement. Daniel's signature was already there. He'd signed it years ago, trusting her to handle the paperwork. Now that signature was her weapon. One stamp, one legal confirmation later. 30 years of marriage unraveled into ink and silence. Outside the courthouse, the air felt lighter. Celia stood in the sun, her folder pressed to her chest. For the first time, the pounding in her veins wasn't panic. It was power. Back at the motel, she made 2 calls. First to the bank, confirming the freeze on their joint accounts, business cards, and Daniel's executive line, the one Arya had been using for client dinners. Then to Daniel's lawyer. "This is Celia Morgan," she said calmly. "As of this morning, I filed for divorce and enacted Clause 14C. Please advise your client to retain separate counsel. Oh, and tell him to check his wallet, it's lighter." Then she hung up. It didn't take long. At 1 p.m., her phone buzzed. "Block number." She answered but said nothing. "Celia," came his voice, low and sharp. That voice, once a lullaby, now just noise. "Where the hell are you?" She let a beat pass. "Somewhere peaceful," she said softly. "You froze the accounts," he hissed. "What are you thinking? Are you having some kind of breakdown?" She laughed under her breath. "No, Daniel. I'm finally having a breakthrough." Silence. She pictured him pacing, running a hand through his thinning hair, looking around the big empty house she'd designed, the house he had filled with lies. "I have a child on the way," he said, as if that justified everything. Celia's smile hardened. "Then I suggest you figure out how to support her, because not a cent is coming from me." "You can't do this," he said. "You don't know what you're doing." That was the moment something inside her solidified. "I know exactly what I'm doing," she said, her tone like glass. "I'm taking back my life. Every dollar, every hour I spent building you." There was a pause. Then a harsh exhale. "Jesus, Celia, stop." "No," she cut him off. "You don't get to talk now. You had 30 years. I was loyal. I was quiet. I gave up everything. You gave me lies. You made me raise your child while you laughed behind my back. And now, you'll learn what happens when the woman you underestimated decides she's done." She ended the call, dropped the phone on the bed, and let the silence settle. She didn't cry. Not anymore. That night, Celia packed her few belongings and moved into a short-term rental. Small, modern, sunlit. No memories. No ghosts. She bought new sheets, white and crisp. Coffee machine for one. A single glass for her wine. When the sun dipped below the hills, she sat cross-legged on the floor, her laptop open beside her, a glass of Merlot in her hand. She watched the sky darken and whispered, "To freedom." For the first time in 30 years, she didn't feel like someone's wife. She didn't feel invisible. She felt dangerous, capable, reborn. And as the first stars appeared above the city, Celia Morgan finally smiled without pretending. 2 days later, Celia woke up to her phone buzzing non-stop. She reached for it lazily, expecting another spam call or perhaps Daniel's latest attempt to beg for mercy. Instead, she froze. The headline glared from her screen like a flare in the dark. Pasadena power couple in shock divorce. Assets frozen amid misconduct allegations. A blurry photo of her from years ago accompanied the article. Her smile bright, her hand looped through Daniel's arm at a charity gala. Celia stared at it for a long moment, then spat out the toothpaste she'd been brushing with. "Well," she muttered to herself, "that didn't take long." By noon, 5 more outlets had picked up the story. By evening, it was trending locally. A popular podcast released an emergency episode titled, "The Fall of Daniel Morgan: Power, Betrayal, and a Frozen Fortune." Celia sat on her sofa, wearing a navy robe and sipping bitter coffee from a chipped mug. The irony wasn't lost on her 30 years of blending in, of being the silent woman beside the successful man. And now she was front-page news. The comment sections were brutal. She finally snapped. She's bitter. Jealous of the younger woman. Celia read them all with a faint, detached smile. "Let them talk," she whispered. They always do, but she wasn't idle. Every rumor, every whisper served her now. She began forwarding anonymous documents, copies of contracts, emails, tax discrepancies, to select journalists she trusted from her past design clients. One of them, an investigative reporter named Elise, called her within hours. "Celia, this is real," she asked softly. "Every word," Celia replied. "But be careful. Daniel plays dirty." Elise hesitated. "So do you, apparently." Celia smiled faintly. "Only when I have to." By the end of that week, the whispers had turned into fire. Daniel's company, Morgan and Sloan Development, was under investigation for financial irregularities. Celia didn't need to lift a finger now. Momentum had taken over. She watched from her living room as the evening news aired footage of him leaving the office, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions. His expression was strained, pale, no longer the calm businessman everyone admired. "Sources close to the couple suggest insider fraud," the anchor said. Celia turned down the volume and leaned back, sipping her wine. "Good evening, darling," she murmured toward the screen. "You wanted new beginnings. Here's yours." But revenge, Celia realized, wasn't about screaming or breaking things. It was about control. Quiet, deliberate, unshakable control. Every move she'd made had been calculated. The asset freezes, the clauses, the contracts, all designed to leave Daniel powerless without her. She opened her planner, her handwriting neat, her tone steady. Tomorrow, she would meet with her attorney to begin negotiations for full ownership of the design branch, the one she had built and he'd taken credit for. "You built your empire on my silence," she whispered. "Now I'll rebuild it on your ruin." Her attorney, Vivian Kane, was sharp, calm, and unapologetically direct. "You've done most of the work for me," Vivian said, flipping through the files Celia had gathered. "This is airtight. You could take majority control of the design subsidiary by next quarter." Celia nodded. "I don't want just control," she said. "I want recognition. My name on the contracts, on the walls, everywhere it used to be erased." Vivian smiled approvingly. "Then we'll make sure it's carved in stone." Celia felt something flutter in her chest. Not nerves, not fear. Liberation. Meanwhile, Daniel's lawyer called again, 3 times. She didn't answer until the 4th. "We'd like to discuss an amicable settlement," he said carefully. "Amicable," Celia repeated, her tone almost amused. He forged my signature, hid his assets, and fathered a child behind my back. Tell him to start with an apology. In writing, public, and verifiable. The lawyer hesitated. That might be difficult. Celia smiled coldly. So is forgiveness. Then she hung up. That night, she poured herself a glass of red wine and wrote a single line in her journal. He took 30 years. I'll take his legacy. The next morning, Daniel appeared on television for a brief interview. Damage control. Celia watched, arms folded. He wore his usual charm like a mask. It's been a difficult time, he told the reporter smoothly. I only hope for privacy and respect for my family. Family. The word made Celia laugh aloud. When the reporter asked about the frozen accounts, Daniel's jaw tightened. Miscommunication, he said. It's being resolved. Celia turned off the TV. You're right, she said into the quiet room. It's being resolved, just not how you think. As the days turned into weeks, Celia noticed how easily she adjusted to solitude. No footsteps echoing down the hall. No phone calls demanding dinner reservations or social appearances. She spent her mornings walking along the boulevard, her afternoons sketching new design ideas, her evenings in quiet reflection. Her laughter came back, small at first, then full, unrestrained. Freedom didn't feel lonely. Felt like coming home. Still late at night, she would sometimes whisper to the empty room, "You underestimated me, Daniel. That's the only mistake I'll ever thank you for." One evening, as she sat by her window watching the lights of Pasadena flicker below, her phone pinged with an email. It was from Elise, the journalist. "Thought you'd like to see this," it read. Attached was a headline scheduled for tomorrow's release. Exclusive. Inside the secret contracts of Morgan and Sloan, fraud, forgery, and family lies. Beneath it, a photo of Daniel entering a courthouse. Celia stared at the image, her reflection merging with it on the glass. "It's time," she whispered. She closed her laptop, poured another glass of wine, and let herself smile, wide, unafraid, and utterly victorious. The game she hadn't started was finally hers to finish. By the next morning, Pasadena woke to chaos. The exposé hit every major outlet before sunrise. Headlines screamed of forged signatures, offshore transfers, and conflicts of interest. Celia's name appeared in every story, no longer as Daniel Morgan's wife but as the co-founder who uncovered a decade of deception. She sat on her couch, barefoot, sipping coffee as the news anchors dissected every detail. "It's strange," she murmured to herself, "how truth feels quieter than lies." The phone buzzed relentlessly. Reporters, former friends, even distant relatives. She ignored them all. Her silence was her final weapon. Daniel's empire collapsed faster than anyone predicted. Within 48 hours, 2 major investors pulled out. The board announced an emergency audit. Lawsuits stacked like dominoes. Photos of Daniel leaving his office in a storm of flashes became viral memes. One headline read, "When your wife knows the books better than you." Celia couldn't help but laugh when she saw it. The same laughter Daniel once mocked as too loud for dinner parties. She laughed anyway, freely this time, because the sound no longer needed his approval. But amid the satisfaction, there was an ache Celia hadn't expected. Not for Daniel, but for the version of herself she'd buried for him. The young designer who once stayed up sketching ideas until sunrise, dreaming of spaces that made people feel something. That night, she pulled out her old sketchpad from a box she hadn't opened in years. The pages smelled faintly of cedar and dust. She began to draw again, lines, textures, light. Her hand shook at first, then steadied. The designs came like breath, like healing. She smiled softly. "Welcome back," she whispered to herself. Days later, her attorney Vivian called with an update. "They're offering settlement options," Vivian said. "Daniel wants to negotiate out of court." Celia raised an eyebrow. "He must be desperate." Vivian chuckled. "He is. But you hold the cards. You can take his entire development branch if you push." Celia exhaled slowly. I don't just want his company, she said. I want his narrative. Vivian nodded. Then we'll let the story tell itself. Celia's eyes flickered with quiet determination. This wasn't revenge anymore. It was reclamation of her name, her work, her identity. That afternoon, a knock echoed at her door. When she opened it, Arya stood there. No smile, no confidence, just fear. Celia, she began, voice trembling. Please, I didn't know it would go this far. Celia crossed her arms. Didn't you? You knew about the contracts, the affair, the lies. Arya shook her head rapidly. I didn't know he'd forge your name. I thought he loved me. Celia tilted her head. He doesn't love anyone but himself. Arya's eyes glistened with tears. He said you'd ruin him. Celia stepped closer, her tone low but steady. He ruined himself. You just helped decorate the downfall. Arya began to sob. He said he'd leave you. That we'd build something new. Celia sighed, her voice almost tender. He said the same thing to me 30 years ago. The words don't change. Only the audience. Arya covered her face, her shoulders shaking. I didn't mean to hurt you, she whispered. Celia paused, watching the younger woman unravel. You didn't hurt me, she said softly. You freed me. Then she closed the door. For a long moment she stood there, listening to the quiet hallway. She felt neither pity nor rage, just release. That night, Celia received a message from Vivian. Daniel's attorneys are requesting mediation tomorrow. I suggest we attend. Celia stared at the text, the glow of her laptop reflecting off her wine glass. She typed back one line. I'll be there, in emerald. The next morning she wore a fitted emerald suit, her hair sleek, her expression calm. The conference room was cold and glass-walled. Daniel sat at the far end, pale, thinner, eyes hollow. He didn't look at her until she spoke. You always liked control, she said quietly. How does it feel to lose it? He flinched. You've made your point, Celia. What do you want? She studied him. This man who once filled every corner of her life, now reduced to a weary stranger. I want everything I built, she said. And your signature confirming it. His jaw clenched. You won't get sympathy from anyone. She smiled faintly. I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm collecting interest. Vivian slid the papers across the table. Daniel hesitated only a second before signing. The scratch of his pen echoed like closure. Celia exhaled slowly. It was done. Outside the courthouse, cameras waited. Reporters called her name, shouting questions about the settlement, the scandal, the betrayal. Celia stopped, straightened her shoulders, and met the flashing lights head-on. 30 years ago, I helped build something that erased me, she said evenly. Today, I reclaimed it. The crowd hushed. For the first time, her name trended online. Not as a victim, not as an accessory, but as the woman who outsmarted her husband at his own game. Vivian whispered. You just rewrote the story. Celia smiled. Good. It's about time. That evening, back in her apartment, Celia poured herself a small glass of champagne. She turned on the radio. Jazz, soft and golden. The city hummed outside her window. She walked to her desk and pinned her first new design sketch to the wall. It was a vision for a space she wanted to open. A studio for women starting over, a place to rebuild beauty from brokenness. She traced her name beneath it. Celia Morgan Designs. The letters looked powerful, alive. She lifted her glass toward the reflection in the window. To endings, she said softly. And the women who make them beautiful. The night answered with quiet applause, the sound of freedom unfolding. Celia's days began to fill again, not with obligation but purpose. She spent her mornings visiting local art galleries, reconnecting with old design contacts who had once admired her work before Daniel's shadow swallowed her career. Some were surprised to see her. Others were quietly proud. We thought you disappeared, one gallery owner admitted. Celia smiled faintly. I did. But I found the exit. She left each meeting with new projects, new ideas. Her name, once hidden in the footnotes of Daniel's contracts, now appeared on glossy proposals of her own. She was building again, but this time under her own name. The first major project came sooner than she expected. A real estate developer offered her the interior design contract for a boutique hotel in Santa Barbara. "We want something elegant, timeless, but brave," the client said during their call. Celia paused, her pen tapping the desk. "Elegant, timeless, and brave," she repeated. "That's exactly what I've become." She accepted the job, driving up the coast a week later to see the site, a seaside property overlooking the Pacific, all sunlight and salt air. Standing on the balcony, she closed her eyes and breathed in the scent of ocean spray. "New beginnings," she whispered. "This time mine." News of Daniel's downfall continued to ripple. His company was sold in parts, his reputation shredded by evidence that couldn't be silenced. Arya disappeared from public view, rumored to have moved abroad. Celia didn't follow her story. She had already closed that door, literally and emotionally. Sometimes, when journalists reached out asking for exclusive interviews, Celia declined. "Some stories," she said politely, "speak better through silence." Yet she smiled privately, knowing her silence echoed louder than Daniel's apologies ever could. Weeks turned into months, and Celia's new studio began to take shape, an airy workspace filled with sunlight and soft jazz. She hired 2 young designers, both women who had left controlling jobs. "This place," Celia told them during their first team meeting, "isn't about starting over. It's about starting right." They listened, eyes shining. The studio's name glimmered on the glass door. Morgan Atelier. Some people told her to change her surname. She refused. "I won't erase it," she said. "I'll redefine it." One afternoon, Lydia visited the studio carrying a bouquet of wildflowers. "You look happy," she said, smiling as she watched her sister work. Celia laughed softly. "I am. Finally." Lydia touched one of the sketches pinned to the board. "I still can't believe you did all this alone." Celia shook her head. "Not alone. Just without him." They shared a quiet moment, sisters who had weathered storms together. "You know," Lydia said thoughtfully, "you didn't just survive, Celia. You evolved." Celia smiled. "That's the only revenge worth having." The Santa Barbara project launched 6 months later. The opening night shimmered with champagne, laughter, and camera flashes. Celia arrived in a simple black dress, no diamonds, no statement pieces, just quiet elegance. As she walked through the lobby she had designed, marble, brass, and warm amber light, guests whispered her name. "That's her," someone said. "The woman who built an empire from ashes." Celia smiled politely, accepting congratulations with grace. But the real victory wasn't the applause. It was the feeling that she no longer needed it. Later that evening, as she stood on the balcony overlooking the sea, a familiar voice broke through the music behind her. "You always did have taste," Daniel said softly. He turned. He looked older, grayer, thinner, humbled. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her tone calm but cold. "I needed to see you," he said. "To apologize." Celia studied him for a long time, searching for sincerity. "I don't need your apology, Daniel," she said finally. "You can't return years. You can only stop wasting the ones ahead." He lowered his head, shame flickering across his face. "I lost everything," Daniel whispered. "The business, the house. Even Arya left." Celia tilted her head, unmoved. "You didn't lose them," she replied. "You traded them for ego, for deceit. I was the only thing you ever had that was real, and you destroyed it." He nodded slowly, eyes wet. "You were right," he said quietly. "You were always the strength." Celia smiled faintly, a trace of sadness in her eyes. "I still am. You just never learned to build with me, only on me." She turned away as the music swelled, her reflection merging with the ocean beyond. When she looked back, Daniel was gone. Just another ghost in a life she no longer carried. Celia leaned against the railing, breathing in the salt and freedom. A wave crashed below, scattering white foam into the moonlight. Felt like punctuation, the kind that ends a chapter with clarity. Her assistant called from inside. "Ms. Morgan, the investors want a photo with you." Celia smiled. "Coming," she replied. She straightened her shoulders, touched her necklace, and walked back inside. Radiant, composed, unbreakable. Months later, an article appeared in Architectural Digest. Celia Morgan, the woman who designed her own resurrection. The feature showcased her work, her studio, and her vision. When she read it, she smiled. Not out of pride but recognition. Every wall she built, every space she created now carried a piece of her freedom. She placed the magazine on her coffee table beside a single photograph. Her younger self, beaming beside Daniel at their first home. She stared at it for a moment, then turned it face down. "Thank you," she whispered to her past. "You were brave enough to survive so I could learn to thrive." Spring arrived in Pasadena with jacaranda trees spilling violet blossoms across the streets. Celia walked beneath them one morning, her coffee warm in her hand, sunlight filtering through the petals like stained glass. The city felt different now. Not louder, not calmer, but hers. She passed the old courthouse where she'd filed for divorce and smiled faintly. Funny, she thought. This was where my life began again. There was no bitterness left, only quiet gratitude. She no longer carried Daniel's name as a wound but as proof of survival, a reminder that she could rebuild anything, even herself. That afternoon, Celia hosted a small gathering at Morgan Atelier. The studio buzzed with laughter and soft music as her team unveiled their latest project, a mentorship program for young women designers. On a white banner behind her, bold letters read, "Rebuild, redefine, rise." She clinked her glass gently to get everyone's attention. "I spent years designing homes," she said, her voice steady. "Now I design second chances." Applause filled the room, warm and real. She met the eyes of the women around her, some nervous, some excited, all inspired. "If you've ever been underestimated," she added with a smile, "welcome home." Later that evening, after everyone had gone, Celia stayed behind. The studio was quiet, lit only by the golden glow of desk lamps and city lights filtering through the glass walls. She ran her hand along the smooth oak table, remembering how her life had been built around someone else's ambitions. Now it was hers alone. The silence was no longer heavy. It was peace. She poured herself a final glass of wine, lifted it slightly toward the empty room and said softly, "To freedom, and to never apologizing for it again." The weeks rolled on gently. Celia's work flourished, but she kept her circle small. Vivian remained her lawyer and friend. Lydia called often, usually to check if Celia was still dazzling people. She was. But more than dazzling, she was living, quietly, intentionally. She spent her weekends visiting art markets, her evenings sketching by candlelight. Once she saw a photo of Daniel online, gray-haired, seated outside a small cafe, looking older than his years. She didn't feel anger, only distance. "We were lessons," she murmured, "not lifetimes." One Sunday morning, Celia received a letter, handwritten, elegant. The return address was from Santa Barbara. Inside was a single page from Aria. "I wanted you to know I had a daughter. I named her Grace. I tell her about strength, and I tell her it looks like you." Celia read the words twice, then folded the paper gently and set it aside. There were no tears, just understanding. Maybe some endings, she thought, echo long enough to turn into beginnings for someone else. Months later, Morgan Atelier expanded into a second location, a renovated brick warehouse filled with sunlight and green plants. The press called it a creative haven. Celia called it sanctuary. On opening day, she stood before the staff and guests, a small gold pin shaped like a phoenix glinting on her lapel. "We build from ashes," she told them. "That's what art is. Turning what was destroyed into something unforgettable." Her words hung in the air, soft and fierce all at once. The applause was thunderous. That evening, she sat in her office watching twilight settle over the city. Her reflection merged with the skyline in the window, not the reflection of a betrayed wife or a silent partner, but of a woman who had mastered her own story. She thought about all the versions of herself she had been: the dreamer, the wife, the fool, the fighter. Each one had led her here. She smiled, whispering, "You made it." And in that moment, for the first time in her life, she truly believed it. As night deepened, Celia's phone buzzed with a message from Elise, the journalist who had first broken Daniel's story. "You know, they're calling you the woman who redesigned revenge." Celia laughed softly. "Then they misunderstood," she typed back. "I redesigned freedom." She set the phone aside and stepped onto her balcony. The air was cool, carrying the scent of jasmine and rain. The city glittered below, alive, untamed, forgiving. Celia closed her eyes and breathed it in. For once, the future didn't scare her. It invited her. In the following months, Celia began writing a book. Not a memoir, but a guide to creative rebirth. Each chapter began with a design principle and ended with a story of resilience. The title came easily: Blueprints for Starting Over. She wrote late into the night, her pen flowing across the pages. Every word felt like a conversation with her younger self, the one who thought love meant silence, who mistook endurance for strength. "You did your best," she wrote in the dedication. "Now let me finish what you started." On the day her book launched, the audience at the signing lined the entire block. Celia sat beneath a banner that read, "Author, Designer, Survivor." When she looked up from signing the 100th copy, she saw Lydia waving proudly from the crowd. Celia smiled, radiant, fulfilled, free. Later that evening she returned home, set the final signed copy on her shelf, and poured herself one last glass of champagne. "To endings," she whispered, raising it to the empty room, "and to women who write their own." Outside, the city lights shimmered like applause, and for the first time in 30 years, Celia Morgan knew she had the final word, and it was hers.